Hello.
We are live.
Hi. So we are all gathered here. The topic of, well, the agenda for this meeting is going to be only one item, and that item is discussing all the discussions that have happened in Scala contributors, which are a lot. So for those that haven't been in the loop about what we are doing, we are basically creating now batches for discussing the different changes that will go into the Scala 3 spec, and we are putting, and we want to get everyone on board with the changes and discuss them before we actually either approve them or reject them. So the idea is that the community can comment on the batches that we have posted in the Scala contributors discourse instance, and they can voice their opinion on them, and then their opinion and their feedback will be taken into account in said meeting. So what we are doing today is to discuss the first batch, which was the simplest one. It was about mostly syntactic changes.
Or so we thought.
Also, we thought, yeah. It was about syntactic changes that we are doing in Scala 3. And therefore, to drive the discussion in the most efficient way, we have kind of distributed a thread per committee member, except that Adrian has now two proposals that he will brief on, because he didn't want to take procedure syntax, so that was a fair price. And therefore, Miles will take care of the auto application change. Sebastian will take care of XML literals. Adrian will take care of delayed init and early initializers, and then ultimately Josh will take care of procedure syntax. So I propose that Miles starts with auto application. So the idea is that every committee member will give a summary of the feedback that we got from the community. That feedback has also been posted in the Scala contributor threads. And from there, we will move on and we will take into account the feedback and discuss it and see what happens. So, Miles?
Okay. So the auto application proposal is basically to align, to insist that call sites of methods, their use of nullary syntax form or a form with empty parentheses, has to exactly align itself with the definition site, rather than it being possible to basically chop and change as it is now. There is an exception in the case of methods which are defined in Java. I think there's also an exception here for Scala 2 for compatibility between 2 and 3. And I think the initial piece of feedback was that it was not at all clear from the proposal exactly what the motivation reasons for this were. To some extent, you know, there's a kind of, I guess you could say there's a preference for consistency between the use site and the call site, but it seems a very minor thing, and I think I kind of agreed with some of the commentators that on its own just didn't really take us very far. And I think one of the very first comments was, you know, it's not really clear what the actual motivation is. It turns out, I think, and people can correct me if I've misinterpreted this, that actually the motivation is contained on a slightly separate DOTI issue, which is basically around making ITER expansion more uniform and consistent. That was an issue raised by Howie. And lurking away in the middle of the discussion on that ticket was a comment by Martin, reporting on a conversation he'd had with Adrian. And basically, it relates primarily to the ETR expansion of nullary methods. I kind of think it's a good proposal in its own right. And it seems to me that the proposal we've got on the table, the one we're discussing, is actually basically a relatively minor corollary of the proposal around eta expansion. I think if you go for that proposal around eta expansion, then you need to go down this route. I am looking at the proposal around eta expansion. The comment from Martin is, let me see if I can find it. It is right. So Martin says, after discussing with Adrian, we're leaning towards the following compromise proposal for handling references to unapplied methods M. If M has one or more parameters, we always eta expand. So this is a bare use of M. If M is nullary, i.e. it has a type unit to R, if the expected type is a zero arg function, then we eta expand. Otherwise, if it's defined in Java or overrides a Java defined method, we insert empty parentheses. Otherwise, it's an error. And then that's also associated with deprecating the underscore syntax for explicit eta expansion. I'm kind of pretty much, and I don't know to what extent we actually want to get into discussing the substance of the proposal. I kind of think. Sorry, Adrian.
Just jump in here for a second. I think, you know, if you do the auto application, or you require, if you require the parentheses, that second awkward case can just go. I think that's. Right.
So I think basically if what we're doing is reporting on the commentary and the discussion on the contributors list, I think the first comment was, hang on, there isn't really a motivation here. Then we're pointed at a completely separate proposal. Well, it's not completely separate, but I mean it's a somewhat more fundamental proposal, which this is a consequence of. I think the comment is probably we need to be basically merging those proposals and making sure they're consistent and that we've actually got something sensible coming out of this. I, for one, am absolutely in favor of anything which makes definition and use of methods and functions more uniform and consistent. So I'm in general in favor of the sort of the more interesting background Dotty proposal. And I kind of think that viewed in that light, I think it's pretty well motivated. I think just treating it in terms of the way that the proposal is currently couched, it actually really isn't that well motivated, and I think some of the objections raised against it probably have a fair amount of weight. But I think, seen in the light of the eta expansion proposal, I think it certainly makes sense. I don't know. There are a few other. I mean, there are a few other comments as well. I'll just briefly summarize some of those. There was a little bit of discussion around the use of empty parentheses to indicate if X or not. I've never liked this, just editorializing. I've never liked that convention. I don't find it particularly helpful. I think we really ought to do something better than that, but still. To the extent that it is a convention that's been adopted, I guess we have to find some way of accommodating it. It's not completely clear. I think it would be useful if it was addressed in the proposal at some point how that's made consistent, and if we should really still be emphasizing that or not. There were some sort of fairly technical parsing issues relating to how does it interact with, say, for example, a nullary method, which nevertheless has an explicit type parameter list, for example. So someone gave an example of currently writing promise of unit, which currently is accepted, but on a strict reading of the proposal would not be accepted now because we would need to be inserting some empty parentheses. On the other hand, writing promise of unit empty parentheses seems rather long-winded and rather unnecessary. And I think that seems, if there's nothing more to this proposal than just a little bit of syntactic tweaking, as opposed to kind of aligning eta expansion, then I think that would be a pretty good objection. Rex came up with some really nice examples of some of the sort of nasty corner cases of sort of chained applications, methods returning functions or other things with apply methods and so on and so forth. made a counter proposal. I kind of think that we ought to look at what Rex is proposing, but again, in the light of thinking about the ITER expansion issue. There was also another. There was a question about whether or not this had an effect on the way that constructors should be understood as well, because I think there is kind of an assumed equivalence between a class with no constructor parameter list at all versus one with, and it's not completely clear how that also interacts with this proposal. But I would imagine whatever happens there ought to be consistent with what we ended up saying for case class apply methods. Beyond that, the final comment was from Gabriele Petronella saying, I'm very much in favor of the spirit of this change, but a bit worried about the actual result. The idea is to normalize things, which makes total sense, but after this change, maybe we end up with more inconsistencies than before due to backward compatibility with Scala 2 and presumably with Java as well. And I think it's a fair comment there. And I think, again, this means we should be focusing on the ITER expansion sort of background motivation rather than just the sort of alignment of syntax between definition and call site.
Thank you. It's a very thorough.
So just one item. So you mentioned I think it was another one of how he used words to say that essentially classes implicitly always take an empty parameter list. And I would like to address that one, but haven't gotten around to that one yet. So that's still in there, and there's some tricky things with new creation syntax that could mess it up also with backwards compatibility. So that's not done yet. So the current one proposal sort of got shaped a little bit by experience of essentially porting the collections and working on the new collections and porting the old ones to see what use cases are there. And it actually was quite shocking how undisciplined it was. So without a strict rule, really, it's all over the place whether people write parentheses and not, and in both definitions and usages. So for that reason alone, I think it helps. But I think you're right, Maisa. The real motivation is the expansion.
Great. So then, like, a good way to move this forward would be just to merge them, I guess. Is there any? Yeah, I guess there is no formalized text about the ETA expansion changes, right? We need to pull them from the thread.
I've linked to your comment, Martin, on the DOTI issue. If you want to have a look at that, I mean that's as formal as it gets, I think.
All right, so I'll take care of merging both proposals and coming up with a new one. And I'll extend the motivation so that we can discuss it in the next round.
Yeah, there is one in the documentation. There is a thing on automatic expansion.
Great, so we can reuse that one then. Yeah. The point about compatibility with Scala 2 is a good one. So I guess that for that we need to make sure that this is also accepted for Scala 2 and implemented then. So was that in the roadmap for 215?
I think there's already some stuff about ETA expansion and interaction with null-array methods. Requiring the inference for methods. I don't think we know that, but we should, at least under a language flag.
Great.
But the point of the current proposal is that it actually would work transparently with Scala 2 even without changes in Scala 2.
But it would be nice if in 214 you could have strict mode as an option so that you.
Absolutely.
So it would be in a strict mode to migrate to Scala 3, right?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, that's a good point. We can reduce that for other changes as well. Great. So it seems that we are all on the same page regarding our application. So maybe we can move forward to XML videos. Sebastian, I'm sure it's your pleasure to introduce us
So here the context of the proposal is to, well, simply remove XML literals from the language. And the proposed migration path is to use string interpolator instead. So this I have gathered the feedback into two main categories: comments that are in favor of the removal and comments that are against the removal. And surprisingly, most of the comments against come from the front-end side of Scala.
Yes. Before we continue, Sebastian created a document that I think has been linked in the Scala contributor thread.
It's not. I mean, unless someone else linked it.
You linked it again, or
I don't think it's.
No? Okay.
No. But I will post it later. I'm sorry I didn't do that earlier. I was time pressed. But I'll highlight now.
You can try to do it now.
The main things. So in favor of the removal, well, probably the biggest thing is that it's a significant burden on the language specification and the compiler implementation. So as Martin pointed out, it basically means that the entire XML spec needs to be inside the Scala spec. So that's a big thing. And if you've ever read the XML spec, this will be clear. Also, the compiler implementation is quite involved. And another, which is kind of related thing, is that Scala XML, which is the library that backs these compiler deshuggerings, is quite complicated. It has some serious usability problems, some performance problems. The typings are a bit weird. So there aren't that many people. I mean, there are objective problems with that library, and of course its API cannot change because it's in sync with the compiler, and the compiler cannot improve its triggering because it's in sync with XML. So then I'm going to switch a little. Yeah, the third big thing is, why should XML be a special case among all the other languages that are out there and that can reasonably be embedded inside Scala? Of course, we can cite JSON YAML, but also SQL and stuff like this. So XML is historically part of the compiler of Scala, but if we were to redesign Scala today and not take that stuff into account, we probably wouldn't put XML inside it. So those are the three main things that are motivating the removal. I'm going to switch a little bit to comments against the removal. So one thing is, there is this promise that we'll have an XML interpolator as a migration path, and one objection is, well, it never kind of materialized. So is it really going to happen? That's one thing. The other thing, which is is the main topic against the removal, is JSX, which is right now on the Scala JS side of things. There are a few libraries that use the XML literals as a means to write embedded HTML generation and templating within the Scala code, which is very similar to how JSX works in the JS ecosystem, in TypeScript, and in other languages that are for the front end. And a few people say something along the lines that, isn't it quite ironic that Scala would remove and drop support for these things now, exactly at the same time that all these other languages start supporting it and embedding it in the language and stuff like this. So it's kind of, yeah, that there is this thing. And so also independently, I mean, so one very big advantage of having XML equals exactly like that and not as an interpolator is that you can simply, copy paste examples from the net and then adapt, fill in the holes and stuff like this, which is marginally nicer than with an interpolator. There is one objective. So that is pretty subjective. There is one objective difference, which is that if without using the recourse of white box macros, it's possible for, well, yeah, it's a bit difficult. I'm not doing saying the right things in the right order. Give me a second to order my thoughts. Yeah, right. So there was a big counter proposal to the whole thing to kind of address both the complaints about it's difficult, it's a big language stack, but at the same time, there are quite a lot of people who actually like this JSX kind of thing, which is a completely separate proposal. It's on a different thread, which would be a named-based XML desugaring. So right now, the compiler, it desugars the XML literals into scala.xml.something. There's only this specific library that works. And yes, there are macros that deconstruct these things and reconstruct other stuff to achieve different results. But basically, it's hardwired to that specific interface. And the proposal, I'm not going into details, but the big idea is to turn that into name-based desugaring, which is to say, I'm just going to call xml.tags.whatever, and whatever happens to be XML in the lexical scope, which will be the implementation that's targeted by this desugaring. That that solves a few problems with the XML literals currently. One, it reduces significantly the burden on the specification. It's only about the parsing and not about namespacing, about this $scope thing that's kind of weird, and a bunch of other stuff like this.
But can you do still namespacing with that?
You can not really. So it's not a direct replacement. You cannot automatically migrate an existing code base to that other stuff, even with the right library. At least it doesn't seem so. Maybe someone will come up with a genius idea. The other big advantage of this compared to the XML editors we have is that it opens more competition against the for libraries, right? Libraries can compete for the better, and also you can have several in the same code base as long as they're not in the same lexical code. And final comment: name-based desugarings are not a novelty in Scala. We have for comprehensions, name-based pattern matching, which are this kind of things.
But they don't rely on global scope injections or on a global thing that this name has to appear globally. So they are methods on something.
So I think that's it for the biggest points. There are smaller concerns here and there, but I mean, it would require many more dozens of minutes to go over the entire thing.
So the counter proposal that Sebastian has described is called name-based XML literals, and it was proposed by Django. So for those of our viewers that are interested, they can just go to this strategy.
One more thing about this counter proposal: the big advantage over both the current XML literals and XML literals that would be in string interpolation is that it doesn't require white box macros to get better types for some tags. For example, if you have a tag for button, you can actually get a button element as a type without white box macros, which some more important stuff happens to Scala. You cannot do without white box macros, neither with XML literals nor with interpolator.
The current XML literals, do they do that?
Not per se.
Not per se.
Some libraries hijack them and
yeah.
re-emit stuff,
Yeah.
like binding Scala, I believe. But the XML literals, they only have a couple of things like seek and seek, or node and node seek, but it's not. You cannot have one for every HTML element.
I have one comment to what Sebastian said. It was already mentioned at the very beginning. I think it would be great if the proposal was clearer about the impact. So it mentioned that theoretically XML literals could be replaced with string interpolations, but as Sebastian said, the implementation is not there yet. So maybe, well, it would be great to understand whether the implementation is supposed to arrive and whether it's our responsibility, or if it's the responsibility of the community. And in that sense, I think it would be great to position the proposal as, let's just remove the feature without speculating about possible replacements. Maybe they'll just, never happen.
I think this is the way it's formulated right now. There is no, right now as it is, there is no consideration of what a proposal of replacement for XML literals would be. Even though we have to think about it.
I would think it needs to be our responsibility to make sure this happens, because otherwise the whole migration thing will be completely hopeless. I should say in the current Kotlin implementation, XML literals still are supported in the same way as for Scala 2. So that's sort of a backstop, but I would really like to be able to remove them. My main reason for removing them actually is that I want to essentially fight this perception that Scala is sort of a huge language with everything, including the kitchen sink, where the kitchen sink is XML, because it isn't really if you look at it. But as long as you have XML, we can't have this argument, because it really does have the kitchen sink.
Yeah, that's a good point. What do you feel about it?
So I think we're saying that XML can be replaced by string literals, right, as a library, but no one's proven that. So I think if you have a library that does that and does it well, like that's the proof you need. So I do think that needs to exist to.
I mean, there have been at least 3 or 4 attempts, but not any that worked all the way. All the way to the last people.
Yeah. Yeah, to give a little bit of context, I don't remember if I think here, did a migration from just XML literals to this interpolated XML. But I don't know where that is, so we probably need to link that and then explore how powerful that is, or whether that allows us to do everything we can in the migration.
I think we need to put that in some library, put it under DocuSign, something like that, before we can seriously do the proposal. But it's a bit of a chicken egg problem, because there's not a lot of motivation for doing that if the decision is that XML will stay around. Nobody feels interested enough to develop a separate XML thing. So if there's a decision that we snap the cord, then well, it's inevitable. We need this thing, and somebody has to do it.
And in general, how do we feel about the counter proposal that we got? Is that an alternative that we should consider? And if so, what are the drawbacks or what
we're going to mention one bad comment we got from them.
Yep.
So it's very short. JSX could be used on the JVM for server-side rendering, of course. So just mentioning it because we got it on the chat. That's good. But yeah, it's not what go back to it.
But I mean, if string interpolation is available, then it's really writing 9 letters around it.
Yeah, but tooling-wise, you lose the syntax adding, so yeah, then you need to lobby with IntelliJ.
Oh, of course, but they will do.
We need to do this.
They already know a lot about string interpolation anyway.
Yeah,
character is not a big deal to say that it's a string literal or interpolated.
So I think in that sense, the discussion really is about, the syntax of it, right?
Yeah.
First, you have to say, do we want to support it in some way? And I think the answer to that is we have to. We can't get rid of it entirely. So then the question becomes, what is the most Scala-like way to support this? And I think something like name-based or something like interpolators sounds like a nice cleanup of what we have right now. And then the biggest challenge is someone actually has to deal with the various XML libraries out there, like things like namespaces and white space, and a lot of that stuff gets very finicky very quickly to really, have full fidelity for what people expect in the real world XML. And I think regardless of whether it's in the parser or in string interpolators or whether it's name-based or not, that's hard. I mean, we have that library sitting there for a long time and it's being maintained, but still those things are not really done. And I think we have to accept that it's unlikely someone like the EFL library like that will take on the task of having like a full spec XML library set picture.
Yeah.
So we might as well say, well, what we have right now in Scala XML, we can really improve, clean up some stuff, but that's basically what we have on the library side.
That's what will happen, I guess. Yeah, it will just be essentially made it accessible through this string interpolator.
Right. So exactly, and then the question really becomes, how do we interface? What is the interface from like the surface syntax side of things to the existing library?
Yeah.
And
and you could provide the hooks that somebody. It would be nice to in the library now to have hooks that somebody can make that put a different XML builder in that or something like that.
So right now that's hard with the current approach, but it's doable. I mean, like it just emits Scala.xml, but whatever method calls. It's not really hard linked to the Scala XML library. It's just very specific to the way that library is implemented. And if the name-based XML proposal can evolve that into something nicer, I think I'm all for that. So then it really becomes between whether we want an evolution of the way that we interface to the XML builder, or we want to keep it with the string interpolator. And then I think you can kind of drill that down to saying, well, we already have string interpolators, they're not going away. So do we want two solutions for embedding other languages in Scala, or do we want one? And then generally we say we want one.
And it's not just embedding, it's really more complicated than that. Because to embed an XML string, you essentially what happens is that the Scala parser hands control off to the XML parser. The XML parser decides when the literal is finished and hands control back. So that means really for the spec, you still need the full XML spec just to be able to parse it, so that you can decide when the literal is finished. Whereas with the string interpolator, of course, you have an end. So you say, okay, from here to here, I hand this over as a black box to the XML interpolator, and it will do whatever.
Yeah, so conversely, if you have like triple quotes in your XML fragment, you have to somehow.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's solvable by IDEs.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so I think so in principle, I'm in favor of having just one way of doing things, and you don't really like, especially since one way is adequate. As always with these proposals, the question becomes, what is the and how good is the Scala fixed rule, or how can we quantify this cost? And I think we can just comment on that, but to try to be objective in these things, I think it's actually really hard to be objective. But it's important to try, I agree. I have no idea.
And as you said, we need someone as well to make experiments. So
I think
figure out what the best solution is.
Yeah, that's another part of it.
Yeah. But I mean, this is probably one of the most trivial Scala fixed rules, right? But
well, not when you have to start escaping things and stuff like that.
In the XML literal, if you want to give that in sense.
Yeah, because you can't just put triple quotes around random XML because that might not necessarily.
Okay, so you have to go in there and triple quotes.
And also you have the interpolated.
Julian, looks like a job for you.
Yeah, well, I think the interpolators also look different. Now you have dollar signs. I think in XML it's just double braces or something like that right now. Yeah, there's. I think this is probably one of the thorny issues actually to migrate automatically.
Yeah, you really have to parse the XML.
I think the other ones are easier to fix, but also I think this has the potential to break a lot more code than the other ones. So I think some migration paths would be very much needed.
And the migration path is sort of provided because we already support the old style. So one could say in 3.0 it would be deprecated. It won't go away. So that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently it's single braces, double twisted braces.
Right.
I don't know. Apparently someone knows better. Also, we have a comment here which is, does it need to have full XML support with namespaces, etc.? To that I would answer, the one thing that is used as a migration for existing XML everywhere, yes. The thing that should be used for a JSX style thing in Scala.js, probably not. Which is one of the advantages I have to have in several libraries that will be able to deal with those things in separate adequate ways.
But my informal impression of the user base for XML literals is that there are still quite a few people who are using it to do generation, but I think I assume that it's a lot rarer to actually be reading in XML using the existing Scala XML support. Does anyone have a different impression? Did we see counter evidence to that?
You mean using XML for pattern matching, particularly?
Right. So like, yeah, exactly.
I think Olaf had some statistics about that in his giant corpus, and apparently pattern matching on XML literals was super rare. Like there were 3 occurrences in his multi-million stuff. Multi-million lines of code. But of course, it's always the open source side of things that you analyze, and you don't take into account all the applications and enterprises.
So if I can add one more data point, I've seen it actually a lot more often than I expected, both in pattern matches and in value definitions. Not open source projects though. So I think there's a fair amount of usage out there, probably decreasing, but in old large code bases you'll still find it.
It's a meta observation about many of the things that we say, yeah, let's analyze the system and see what's the usage patterns. And we often answer, let's look at the community build or something like this. And there is a huge bias in the community build. It's mostly libraries. You won't find that many side effects in libraries. So you might not find that many posterior syntax in them. You probably won't find many exact pattern matching on XML literals, because that is highly business model specific. So you won't find those things in the library. You will find them in applications.
One thing that came to mind is to talk to JetBrains. They collect a lot of statistics about how people use their IDEs in Scala code, so they can tell you what imports people have and so on. Perhaps they can also collect information about XML patterns and share it. I'm sure they would share it with the Scala Center, actually. And that would also give you data points from non-open source projects.
Myself, I have a library for XML RPC uses XML.
I'm sorry, guys. I think that you're either moving a bit farther from the microphone with every 10 minutes or something is going on, but I have huge troubles hearing you.
Here now? Or... Hello?
Yes.
Is
it just me or?
Yeah, you're still pretty low, guys. Yeah, it's the same on my side. I hear everyone perfectly except for the, Lausanne room.
Same.
Oh man.
Yeah, this one is old, but yeah, let's move to it.
Okay.
I know that's the wrong way actually.
So what about now?
It's better.
Yeah, if you hug it, then it's really good.
Yeah, so let's try to be closer to the mic when we speak.
We we'll ask for budget from the TFL.
Yeah, what I was saying is that myself I have a library to talk XML RPC. There I use XML. But yeah, anyway, so we should probably talk to JetBrains as well. Let's move now that we have discussed about this. We'll probably a conclusion in the next meeting that we need to finish the discussion. But let's move now to the next discussion. So, Josh, if you don't mind, would you like to start with the
Yeah, okay. So there were a lot of comments about this proposal. This is a proposal to basically remove being able to just open curly braces after a method definition to denote that something returns unit. So what I did was I collected a lot of the community concerns. I think the main concern actually is just a lack of motivation on this proposal. I think we thought that this was a unquestionably good proposal and we didn't have to motivate why. And that is never the case. We should definitely motivate why we're doing this more. So things that I think are fixable in terms of the proposal. People are concerned that it seemed to imply that people, and possibly the rewrite tool, would change the existing. Oh, did I cut out? Am I back?
I can hear you.
I can hear you too.
We lost Lausanne. That's great. Okay. I guess we should wait for them to come back.
All right, sounds good.
Or maybe it was another volcano.
Wait, I see their little picture, but it's frozen.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
frozen to me.
Which is the real hangout now? Our hangout or their hangout?
That's the big question. Network partition. Let's hope for eventual consistency. I think we should independently make decisions on all the outstanding issues. And
I see a little live thing. So anything we decide now is law. So. Yeah, one thing I do want to say since we're live, and I think it's kind of important to mention, was some of the conversation and discussion was actually calling into question the authority and or judgment of the proposer of the SIP, which I do not think is ever appropriate in one of our mailing threads. And so I just wanted to raise that as something like, if you do this, I will certainly ignore your comment because that's not a legitimate way to make a technical argument. Anyway. Okay, there's my rant. I don't know if you guys agree with that or not.
I think this was partially motivated by the motivation part of the proposal, right? As you said, we kind of assumed that it's self-evident to like everyone, right?
Right. So I think it's a burden on us to put more motivation. But if your only argument is that you're calling into question whether the person uses mutable syntax, I think that's not a valid argument. Okay, now, anyway, one thing I did from this proposal, I went through my code bases and I looked through where I use the most procedure syntax. So this involves a particular code base, which is very, very, very side effecty, and a second toy project that I have, which is a Minecraft plugin. Which is awesome, but also very side effecty. In both cases, I found there was a lot of :unit in these code bases. So there was a concern that like people who are proposing this like aren't writing side effect things, and I think that is actually unmotivated. Anyway, let's walk through things I think are fixable. We need to add more motivation as to why. There was a pro that this is safer. I think that just needs a little bit of discussion for why it's safer. And then there was another pro that it would clean up refactoring tools for how to treat these methods. And that's one that I think you could debate. Like the reason the refactoring tools are hard today is because of how we parse these methods, right? So you could argue that we could change the parser and make the refactoring tools better. I think the important point there is more that it's hard to parse these things. Given the way things are structured. So I think that, again, the motivation just needs to be cleaned up a little. Okay, and then there were some pros that people were listing. So we'll go through those quick. basically clean up an inconsistency in the language. Everywhere else where you define things, you say, def val var, and then you have an equals. And then you have an expression on the right-hand side. So it cleans that up. Also, dropping a return value can be dangerous. And we did find when we teach Scala classes, oftentimes people would forget to put the equal sign, their code would be broken, they'd have no idea what was going on until an instructor came and helped them. That was a very, very, very common thing for people learning Scala. So on the con side, those were actually, I didn't see, most people were complaining about this change, by the way, as opposed to people who agreed with it just said +1. So there weren't a lot of pros listed. Anyway, for cons, we had basically, it's a more verbose syntax to safely ignore return values. So if I'm trying to actually ignore a return value, I have to put :unit now. And then the other concern was that lazy people will just write def foo : equals, and they will get inferred return value arguments and bad behavior. The two things I want to point out here, the more verbose syntax, I think that's a semi-legitimate concern. The thing that I find myself, I always add that to make sure it's explicitly unit. So like, I think that might just be over time, developers need to change their habits to just, annotate return values when it's important. It's weird to me that when I want to annotate a return value in one case, I put the type, and when in another case, I don't put a type, right? So I think that that argument to me, I understand, but I definitely don't agree with. The question about lazy people writing just an equal sign and getting bad behavior, I think this is partly due to the way the write-up was written, where it looks like we're going to rewrite existing procedure syntax into just def foo equals, right? Because it says this is a viable option. I think you just drop that from the proposal. We don't want people to be writing that, I think, for these cases. We want them to explicitly say unit. But even so, like def foo equals, that's a problem in general in the Scala language, and this proposal doesn't make it better or worse, I would say. So those were kind of my, anyway, I'm adding a little bit of my flavor to this. Those were kind of the big cons. The other cons that, there was a few counter proposals that are interesting. Someone proposed having complete effect tracking. I think that's a bit overkill. We had a proposal for multiple def keywords where you could have a different keyword that would mean this is a side effecting function where you don't have to write :unit. Again, that feels overkill because it's another inconsistency in the, like it's an additional bloat to the language. And then there was another proposal for using :equals for side effects. That counter proposal had a lot of negative weight on the thread. So that's the basic summary. There are a few other like smaller points here and there that I didn't think were worth calling out. The big thing is basically some people feel this is going to make it more verbose to basically say, yes, I explicitly want this to return unit. I think, and so we just have to debate, is the consistency win worth that? And yeah, I have a feeling, I kind of think no one here, I don't know. Most of the people I talk to don't disagree with that, but it's something we should still discuss and consider.
So just one thing I'd like to add. I think the procedure syntax has been deprecated for about 5 years now. So I don't think it's a huge surprise if this one goes away in Scala 3. And Scala 3 is, we should probably think about it as the Scala for the next 15 years or so. So if we want to drop some things, this is the moment. And third, I'm not the first one to say it, but I think this is really the easiest refactoring to automate, code base. So I think this can be really a complete zero cost migration.
Well, so it's not zero. It's not one of the arguments was developers' habits are currently to just use procedure syntax,
all right,
and then
right.
and so the developer has to learn something new. But that's a really short-term view of the world, right? Like when we're talking about this change that makes it more consistent, I think the big motivation that I see is people learning Scala. When you make a mistake here, it's bad. and it takes you a lot longer to learn the language. And if you never come back to it, right, that's a problem.
Yeah,
so
we should fix that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Whereas an existing developer, yeah, you run into it, for the first month or so, and it's frustrating, but there's an automated tool to refactor your code so it still compiles, and eventually you'll learn that, right? So I think for existing developers, it's maybe a little bit more annoying, but it's not the end of the world. And if it helps new developers learn things faster and better, I think for me, this is totally like, I understand the concern, but I think we need to take the long-term view.
We cannot hear you guys like at all.
Yeah, when you talk very loud.
Something that we mentioned in the thread, is that IntelliJ already links you if you are using procedure syntax right now in Scala 2. So it's true that not all the Scala developers use IntelliJ, but a big part do. Okay. So they will get that out of the box. They will not need to rewrite anything. And if they write procedure syntax, they automatically get a warning.
Yeah, so this is also something that I wanted to bring up. What's the migration strategy exactly here? So is it possible to do a batch migration for a big code base? Or will it be necessary to go through your code in IntelliJ? So in the thread, there were frequent references to some automated way to do this. So I believe just like with the XML literals and string interpolation, if we're referring to an automated migration, we have to have it at hand, like working. So maybe we would also want to include this in the proposal.
Yeah, wasn't there an existing Scala user way to do this?
I'm not sure. Maybe we just need to link it. It would be great to have an example GitHub project or something like this, so that there is actually, well, so that people can try it out to be able to evaluate the proposal.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, the assumption that the tool exists is there, and so it needs to be proven for people. So now the thing is, though, even with the tool, some people still think that's not good enough. But again, I think the proposal definitely needs to say there's a tool, and I think the proposal needs a little more motivation behind it, and that's the only action I see needed for that. I'm also about to get kicked out of my room, so I got to go.
Thank you, George.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
I'll forward a couple of things we've received on the chat. So when recalls that I would also like to note that some people feel that having colon unit is more difficult to visually pick out in procedure syntax, which indeed there was a comment about that. I also personally recall some comments that said that in some cases for beginners it's actually better to have this procedure syntax in some contexts. And then, yeah, some people confirmed that the Scala fixed rules exists and that it has been used notably on Scala itself.
Yeah,
for
I remember,
procedure syntax.
I remember a PR from Eugene doing this. Yeah. Good. Eugene Jokoda.
Okay. Do we still have delayed in it? Or
yes, we have two more.
I just want to mention one more thing about the procedure syntax, which is that it isn't actually deprecated, or it wasn't actually deprecated until 2.13 OM4.
Right. I mean, it was under X future, but nobody uses that.
Right. So it's been sort of informally deprecated in our minds for a long time, but I think maybe part of the reason there were so many responses is that that wasn't as widely known more broadly. But, I don't know. Regardless, I do think we should go ahead.
Yeah. Let's quickly move to the last two proposals. So I think we'll take care of the summaries of delayed init and early initializers, and we can discuss them together because we don't have a lot of time. Whatever is left for discussion will be discussed in the next meeting. And yeah, I'll review more about that in a while, in a little bit.
So let's do the easy one first. Who wants to predict which one? Early initializers. I think it's clear that since we basically are committed to doing trait parameters, and early initializers are a less nice way of doing trait parameters, it just makes no sense to have both. Then the question is it easy to rewrite? And there, I would wager that they are not used a lot. I'm sure people are using them, and we've had some good discussions on the thread. But I feel like we will reach consensus there and say, like, look, for the trade parameters are clearly nicer. And in the meantime, yes, there will be a cross-building challenge, but since trade parameters are scheduled for 2.14, I don't think that is really like an argument that will hold in favor of keeping early initializers around. That's really all I want to say about this, unless someone wants to make a passionate plea for keeping them around.
There was a comment on the discussion thread, and it goes along the lines of what we discussed today. So the proposal to deprecate early initializers, it relies on some future feature that hasn't been shipped yet. So maybe we could be more conservative and wait until that feature is actually shipped. Well, just like with the XML interpolators and procedure syntax and the Scala fixed rewrite.
Well, so I think this is always the chicken and egg problem. And we just talked about procedure syntax being a surprise, being deprecated. I've always been of the opinion that it's better to annoy people for a while and actually let them know that they're using deprecated stuff, rather than waiting until you have the replacement and then have a cycle where you maintain them. That's my personal opinion. I'm not saying that's the law.
I'll say that I'm the opposite opinion.
Right. And so
trade parameters are a bit different. So it was also mentioned on the thread in the sense that people can rewrite them now, but they will rewrite them to something else than trade parameters. And when trade parameters come out, and they will probably be more succinct, and they will rewrite the code again. So it will be like double migration. So in that sense, I think this is a special case.
Well, no, I mean, it's the usual. I mean, and I agree with that comment. And that's why I said, trade parameters, we're all operating under the assumption, which I hope will be true, that trade parameters will be supported in 2.14. So, I guess the compromise scenario here is that they will be deprecated when you're compiling under X source 2.14 on 2.13, and might even be supported on 2.13 under that flag. They will definitely be supported on 2.14 and will also be deprecated on 2.14. And I don't know, is that something?
All right. So because I just had an impression that currently in master, in 2.13 master, they're deprecated unconditionally.
Yep.
But yeah, so if they're deprecated under X source 2.14, then it's great. I mean, I don't have any comments.
That's not a difficult fix. I mean, I think, yeah, like I just told you why they're aggressively deprecated.
Right.
So
then it would make sense to merge this proposal with trade parameters.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's true for a lot of things, though, right? Where there's a lot of yin and yang going on here between the different things. I think maybe it makes more sense to have a kind of overview document. And I think, for example, Martin in the keynote presented a lot of the rationale behind, which removal goes with which addition and so on. It would probably be good to have a write-up on that.
Yeah.
There is another comment from the live chat, which, yeah, I mean, it was bound to happen. I think it's okay to have deprecation messages if we have a warning suppression mechanism.
Yeah. So
Adrian, when do we get the warning suppression mechanism?
Hey, I mean, as soon as I can figure out how to design a configuration language for that thing.
But don't you get just this there were deprecation warnings and you have to turn it on?
But but I mean the real world use case is that people are compiling with X fatal warnings and deprecation on, and they just can't, then what do? Their code stops compiling when you start using deprecated things.
Fatal warnings, yeah.
So for a long time, and we've done some work behind the scenes to make this possible, is that you would be able to say, well, deprecation warnings that have been active since, let's say, 2.10 are now errors, and deprecation warnings that have only been introduced recently are warnings. That would be great. That would be very easy to implement, and I would be very happy to coach anyone who wants to work on this. And I agree, it's getting more and more urgent so that no one does it. We will eventually have to do it, but we're just very short on time with the whole stack of work that we have in front of us. Of things that basically at this point only we can do in time. That's something that would be a great thing. Great. But yeah, I very much agree with that sentiment.
Maybe we can make that more explicit in the thread so that people, there is more exposure to that.
Whatever we can do to attract people to that would be great.
Great.
I've been, that's what on my wish list for many years now, unfortunately. So the late init, I felt very torn about this for a long time, but I think I'm feeling better about dropping it now. So obviously this is all me editorializing. There was a very productive thread on there, which I hope to correctly summarize by saying that there's essentially two use cases. One is kind of the AOP style of like you want something to happen before and after some stuff that actually happens to be in the body of a class rather than a method. I personally would be hopeful that the stuff that needs to be, customizable can actually be just put in a method, and then you can invoke that method at your convenience with some stuff happening before and after, rather than having the compiler do all kinds of funny tricks with pulling right-hand sides of file definitions into methods and delaying their execution and so on. So I think that's one very common use case, and the key concern there is how will the migration look for specs and Scala tests and so on? Will it be possible without the late init to make something that looks as nice as what they have right now? Because the practice is that a lot of that stuff actually does happen in the bodies of classes. So that's the big challenge there. And then the other one was more kind of generic DSL stuff, where we're hopeful that better support for the builder pattern through implicit functions might subsume that use case, but there's still active discussion going on around, basically with implicit function types, you instead of using scoping to make stuff available, you actually rely on whether the arguments are available or not. But that does conflate your namespace. And if you have different DSLs that use the same names for things, you have no way to really disambiguate them. So that's a real world use case that was brought up by someone, and I don't think we have an immediate answer for that with what we have right now in the implicit function types toolbox. But there might be tweaks to that we can do. So again, very much hypothetical alternatives for something that we're deprecating, but I think that's kind of that's a good start. Like how do we encapsulate the use cases that we see in the wild, and how do we start replacing them? So I guess the question is there a use case that we're missing, and then how do we proceed with providing migration paths along those two paths?
What about app?
Yeah. So I think app, we can't get rid of it. Even in the proposal, it says remove the generalized late init support, but keep support for app. If someone wants to make a nicer app thing, like where the main method or top level definitions or something, I think that's probably a separate thing we can discuss. But given how many extends app occurrences there must be in the wild, I think that one is just there to stay, and it's a more narrow use case that we can just special case that and then support that way, I think. But yeah, that's funnily enough actually hasn't really been discussed in the thread.
So we
It has been discussed in the Scala dev ticket though.
Okay.
Right.
There is a Scala dev ticket by Lucas, I think. He was looking into it.
Oh, the main method.
Yeah.
Is it actually simpler to support that specific one than the general one? What makes the general one harder to support than just app?
Well, there's actually most use cases in app can be perfectly well supported by just have an empty inherited main that works perfectly. There are two things. You don't get command line arguments that way, but most applications, most simple use cases of app don't need them.
Mm-hmm.
And second, it's
synchronization.
And third, it's really bad for benchmarks, because typically these object constructors don't get optimized very well. So if people write a small benchmark with app, then they get really lousy performance numbers. That's why that was the main motivation to switching to the late init for the new apps. So yeah, so that's the main reason.
Great.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we have to unfortunately wrap up.
Yeah, so we need to sleep on this, and then
Okay.
we'll probably make a decision in the last meeting. So there is still, I think, 14 more days of discussion allowed in the thread.
Mm-hmm.
After the 14 days, we will close the threads and we will wrap up everything. So there will be like another summary discussion or the summary thread from the committee here, and we will make sure that we are on the same page. So,
And, that's,
and we're gonna prepare now for the second batch.
batch of
So Martin will put forward the batch that will be mostly about types, so intersection types, types, or types, etc. And aside from that, I think that we will just keep everyone posted. That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Take care.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye,
you.
guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay.